Hello, everyone. Russ of Aquarium Pets here with Invertebrate Dude. Today, we're going to talk about an isopod species that, to quote Invertebrate Dude, is criminally underrated.
Yep.
It is Porcellionides or Porcellionides virgatus. And that species may or may not be actually what it is, but that's what it's currently known as.
Yep.
And so could you give us a little introduction to the species, where it's from and its basic description and so on?
Yep. So Porcellionides virgatus seems to be a U.S. native, possibly endemic to mostly the southern U.S. There are specifically a lot of very different populations in Florida, a lot of geographically isolated populations on the different keys. And Porcellionides virgatus may or may not constitute a species complex, actually. It might be a lot of undescribed species in the same complex. So everything we have right now in that complex keys out to virgatus for now, but eventually that species may be split into more. But so there's a lot of very pretty populations of them, a lot of very different looking populations. And yeah, the patterning on them can be absolutely insane, especially like the Big Pine Key locality. That's my favorite for sure. But yeah, a lot of very pretty ones. So seem to be endemic to the U.S. and they are usually found in warmer areas as well. So yeah, it's a very interesting species, possibly a species complex, and it will be very cool to see what unfolds there taxonomically as genetic analysis is done on them. They get to about scaber size, I want to say, in terms of body length. They're much more narrow than scaber, but they do get about that big. And another interesting thing about them, too, is that Porcellionides is an old world genus. So these will actually probably be moved to their own genus over time, virgatus, because it shouldn't be in Porcellionides. But yeah, so they get about scaber size in terms of length, especially the males get pretty long. Somewhat long uropods, too, on the males, especially.
So there's some dimorphism there. Cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and in terms of morphs, there's not really any morphs of these species at the moment. Just a lot of different strains and populations in the hobby that you could kind of consider morphs, because they're all different in terms of coloration and patterning, and a lot of them are just very variable within their own populations as well. So
there are a lot of localities out there, but within those localities, you see a lot of variation in some of those.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So as far as I know, there aren't really any common names for this species, just locality names. Is that right?
Yeah. As far as I know, I did try coining the term Big Pine Key beauties for the Big Pine Key locality, but I don't think that caught on. So yeah, no one's really using common names for these, which, I don't mind. I prefer Latin anyways.
Yeah.
And keeping that locality information, especially for these, is very important, since there may be different species, and at the very least, each locality is very unique. Right. So, labeling them as species and locality is probably the best anyway. So,
yeah, I agree. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So, about the reproduction of the species, I know a lot of true Porcellionides are known for their basically prolific nature. Can you tell us how these compare to like powder blues, for example?
These are much slower breeding than true Porcellionides. They are not slow breeding though for an isopod, but compared to those like Porcellionides prunosus and floria, which you could use as feeders, these are much slower breeding. I would say they have similar sized broods, but they produce broods far less frequently.
Okay.
Like once every couple months, maybe. And the babies take quite a while to mature. And it's weird because they stay small for a very long time, and then all of a sudden, like, will shoot up and growth really fast. So, like, you go from like having a bunch of little babies to a bunch of like sexually mature individuals. I rarely catch them when they're in that in between phase, which is pretty odd, but
That is odd. Yeah.
might reflect some sort of like seasonal thing in the wild. Maybe they, have periods of time where they don't have a lot of food and they stay small, and then the rains come or something, and all of a sudden they have a whole bunch of more nutrients available to them, and then they shoot up in growth.
Oh,
Maybe.
yeah.
I don't know. That could be something.
That kind of
But
makes sense.
I have noticed that they stay small and then they just shoot up in growth.
Okay.
So I would say it takes about like 4 months for them to reach sexual maturity, which isn't that long for an isopod, but compared to like the pruinosis, which are mature in like a month, it's quite a bit longer.
Yeah.
So,
quite a bit of a difference there.
But once they get going, they can be, the colony produces pretty well.
Mm-hmm. And brood size, you were saying they're about the same as pruinosis, which are
so it's about like a dozen.
Not a huge brood, yeah.
Yeah, not a huge brood. And pruinosis don't usually have huge broods either, but they produce broods like really quickly.
Yeah, frequently, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So have you noticed any seasonality with their breeding? You were mentioning a possible seasonal connection with their growth.
Yeah. In terms of breeding, they just seem to breed year-round.
Okay.
So pretty consistent breeders. So that's good at least. No diapause requirement or anything like that. I keep them pretty warm year-round. I think they'll breed in like the 70s, low 70s. But I keep mine at like 80 Fahrenheit.
Okay.
So they can take it pretty warm, which makes sense because they're a southern species. So
yeah, that does make sense. Yeah. Anything else unique? You mentioned about how the juveniles will suddenly shoot up in growth. Anything else unusual about how they reproduce that you notice?
Not really. They're pretty standard in terms of isopod care and growth. It's just that weird thing with the babies staying small forever, and then all of a sudden they're, big. So that's the only thing that's the only little quirk I've noticed with these guys so far.
Sounds good. So can you just kind of give us your care regimen for this species, what you do with the substrate, ventilation, all that stuff?
So I give them about like an inch of substrate. They're not heavy burrowers. They will burrow through like the top like few millimeters of the substrate. They seem to like hiding like just below the substrate layer. But then they also cling to bark and stuff too. I keep them, and this is the weird thing, they seem to like relatively high humidity, especially air humidity, but low moisture.
Okay.
So for me, I keep my colonies like entirely humid, but with a lot of ventilation. And because the air humidity is so abysmal here, that seems to work well. When I tried giving them actual like humidity gradient, I would always find them on the humid side. So then I stopped giving them a gradient, and they seem to breed better. But my friend who has sent me most of these, Alan John, he's the one who established them in culture and brought most of them into the hobby. He keeps them more like Spanish Porcellio. He only keeps like a corner of the enclosure humid and the rest dry and well ventilated. But where he lives in Alabama, the air humidity is super high. So that makes more sense why he's able to do that, why they do better for him there. So I guess I would say that these like it semi-humid. So safe bet is just keep them well ventilated, but give them a 50-50 humidity gradient and just monitor which side they prefer for you, right? So if they seem to be sticking to the dry side, maybe keep them on the drier side. If they seem to only be in the humid substrate, maybe increase the humidity and, trial and error your way there. They're pretty forgiving. They don't seem to like just drop dead if the humidity is wrong, like a lot of the Spanish Porcellio do. So you'll be able to, trial and error your way to figuring out exactly what they like best for you. So pretty forgiving.
Seems likely that mine will be if I treat them more like you do, I'll probably be okay since my humidity
probably. Yeah, exactly. We're pretty close. So yeah. And then ventilation, as I said, they like pretty high ventilation. Give them lots of bark hides, lots of leaf litter. Feed them dog food and maybe the occasional dead roach for supplemental protein, and they do pretty well. Only thing I'd say is they're somewhat sensitive to pest infestations. I almost my big pine key culture kind of crashed towards the tail end of last year because their substrate was completely filled with orbated mites, those little red shiny mites, which most isopods don't mind in like lower densities, but the Porcellionides substrate was like writhing with them. So, and then they just stopped breeding. But then I just gave them fresh substrate, waited a couple months, and they're back to breeding pretty prolifically. So they fully recovered. So yeah, it's a pretty forgiving species, to be honest. But you know, they have their little quirks and care. But yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Are there any other? You mentioned a couple of quirks. Are there any difficulties with this species that you mentioned?
Yeah, not really. It's just figuring out the exact humidity they like and making sure the pest populations don't get out of control, or the two big things. Other than that, they're pretty hardy. They're pretty bulletproof. So,
okay,
yeah, it's pretty easy species. I like them.
Would you call this species suited to like a bioactive enclosure as a cleanup crew, or not really?
I don't think they would be a very effective cleaner crew, but at the same time, they wouldn't like outcompete most things you put them in with. I don't think, because they're kind of one of the slower breeding isopods. So it's not like Scaber where they might, overwhelm something that you put them in with. These are pretty docile and pretty slow. They're on the slower breeding side of the isopod spectrum. So I would say you dump them in a bioactive, and they probably make a nice, pretty addition. I don't know how great they'd be at keeping like mold and rot down, though.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So is there something you just want to kind of showcase them in something, and they're not going to be in an enclosure with something that eats them?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. So how are they as a display isopod? I mean, that's mainly what they're kept for, is for their attractive pattern and whatnot. How are they with visibility, like in the daytime? Are they out and about? Are they a little shyer? How are they?
They're pretty secretive.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate because they are so pretty. But yeah, again, they spend most of their time underneath their bark hides or just below the substrate. So yeah, they don't really like light.
Okay.
I'd imagine once the population density got like really high, you would start seeing more of them out and about. But yeah, they don't like being out and about. They're pretty secretive. So not the best display, but that is their being pets is their primary keeping purpose in the hobby right now. So
okay.
Yeah.
So maybe it's fair to say that they're kept for their beautiful appearance, but they're not display isopods in the sense they're not going to be out and about so much.
Exactly.
Big, dense colony.
Yeah. Not like the Marylinella.
Right.
That are just out and about all the time.
They're kind of amazing. They're like, let's create an extremely beautiful and extremely day active isopod, and there you go.
God, my amber bees are probably my favorite isopods right now. They're so pretty.
They're amazing, yeah. So how is their feeding response? If they're secretive, or they're a little shy about going after food, or?
I've never seen them eat, so there's that. But they do eat quite a bit of protein, especially, I'll throw the dog food in there, and it's usually gone within a week. So, which is more than I can say for a lot of my isopod cultures. So, yeah, they're pretty. They eat quite a bit, but I don't see them eat. So they're pretty secretive eaters, I would say.
Okay.
Again, it's a pretty photosensitive species. I don't think they don't like light or disturbances.
So as far as like lifting up bark to look at them and stuff like that, are they going to run off, or do they burrow? How do they react?
Well, half of them will just run as soon as you lift the log up, and then the other half will just kind of like stay completely still, like hoping you don't see them. They like stiff. And it's funny too, because when you drop them like off of the bark, they like do that like half curling thing that some Porcellio do. Or they just like, it almost looks like they're trying to congle bait, but they can't.
They fail.
And so it just looks like they're playing dead.
Okay, like Porcellio virgatus does.
Yeah, exactly like those. Yeah. Okay. So they do that.
Cool.
So yeah.
So it sounds like a really awesome species. More people should be keeping it in the hobby, but don't expect a whole lot of like daytime activity if you're trying to display them.
Yeah.
That'd be an effective summation.
Yep. They're relatively easy. Some of the strains are super pretty, very underrated. But again, yeah, not like a super display species. It's more so if you want to see them, you're going to have to lift up that bark and look for them. But, once you get a good colony going, any piece of bark you lift up should have a bunch of them underneath it. So then you see all the colorations. And the colonies definitely look their best when there's a lot of individuals, because then you get to see like the full extent of the variability within them. Because each of these strains has like such a huge variety of color patterning within each locality, which is really awesome. Like a lot of the strains especially seem to have like very high orange individuals. So you get some of those that are like completely orange, and then like the big pine keys will get a lot of high yellows, even ones that got that like minty green, like white splotching on them. The variability is insane. So definitely, once you get a big colony and you just lift that piece of bark up, and it looks like an Armadillidium vulgare like gem mix, right? Or like it looks like one of those gem mix morph mixes that people sell, but it's not a mix. It's just that one locality has that much variability.
A pure locality with that much variability. Yeah, I love that about certain things. Exactly. So that's fantastic.
Yeah,
like Santa Lucia or something like that.
Yeah.
Things like that. So
with the Punta Canas. Yeah.
Right. So well, thanks a lot again for joining us. And I have your website down here at the bottom of the screen that's been scrolling. So anywhere else you'd like people to be able to contact you?
You can contact me on Facebook, either Invertebrate Dude on Facebook or TJ Umbrell is my personal account. Instagram, Invertebrate Dude as well. That's my name on most things. I have a YouTube channel too. So yeah, that's my plug.
Cool. Yeah, and as we were saying before we started recording, you do early morning maintenance streams. Join in and ask questions and things like that if they're available during that time, and if they're not, just watching the replay is fun too. So that's what I generally end up doing because of my schedule. But it's a great way to learn about what you're into, your projects. You give great tips for husbandry on various species, whether they're isopods, roaches, crickets, whatever you happen to be working with. So hopefully people can join in on that.
Yeah.
And nice. Thanks once again for joining us. It's been great to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's always great being here.
Yeah, we'll have you again in the future for sure.
Sweet.